This is the part two of the interview that we were having with Dr. Abhinav Pandya. Um, it's an extension of a couple of the ideas that he had discussed earlier on regarding the philosophy and perhaps some strategic aspects of terrorism. And we would like to treat this as a part of an awareness session for those who don't particularly understand the origins of certain terror outfits. So thank you very much, Abhinav, for your time once again. Let's start with the first question. How did um, Jaish Mohammed strategically organize itself from being a covert organization to a full-blown threat for India? And just to interrupt you before we begin, this particular interview is based on Abhinav's book, Inside the Terrifying World of Jaish Mohammed. Over to you, Abhinav.
Uh, Thank you, Rajita, for inviting me. Well, Jaish Mohammed is still a covert organization. It's a clandestine organization. As a terrorist outfit, you have to work as a covert entity. But yet, I mean, it's again, I mean, it's a full-blown threat to India's national security. And it started as a after the release of Maulana Masood Azhar in 1999, after the Kandahar hijack, and initially it was funded by ISI and by Osama bin Laden's Al Qaeda, and I think ISI invested a lot of money in this organization because Masood Azhar had that charisma that he could attract a lot of people as followers and as mujahids in his this organization. And after that, it started to specialize in some focus in some key areas like the suicide bombings and Fidain attacks. So that became its forte. So Jaish was the first organizer. I mean, Jaish organized the first Fidain attack in Jammu and Kashmir outside the Legislative Assembly in Jammu and Kashmir, and then again outside the Badami Bagh cantonment in Srinagar. And after that, Jaish organized a Fidain attack at the Indian Parliament in New Delhi, which brought the two countries almost on the verge of a full-fledged war. And that with that, Jaish was catapulted to a global stage. It made a big entry with its signature Fidain attacks, and Jaish was seen by the Indian strategic community as a major security threat. Once again, in 2019, it orchestrated the Pulwama Fidain attack, killing 40 Indian soldiers, and brought India and Pakistan on the verge of a full-fledged war. And after that, Jaish has changed its tactics. Today, it continues to threaten the Indian national security interest in the form of its through its proxy organizations like the PAFF, that's People's Anti-Fascist Force. PAFF is operating in Jammu region. They infiltrate mostly through the Kathua region, but they are quite active in Doda, Kishtwar, Jammu region, and their operations are highly militarized. And the level of training of the Jaish, the PAFF cadres, which are basically Jaish cadres, is very high. And through their infiltration routes which they are using and their tactics and their training levels, it can be easily inferred that they're Jaish cadres and Jaish proxies. Some analysts, I mean, they get confused by saying that they're basically the Lashkar offshoots, the PFF, but that's a flawed analysis, I must say, and that comes from a very superficial way of looking at militancy in Jammu and Kashmir. Jaish has a certain way. Jaish has always used the Jammu border, the Pathankot Punjab border to infiltrate, and PAFF is infiltrating through that region only, mostly through Kathua. So Jaish continues to be a major security threat to India.
In your earlier articles, you've mentioned how ideological origins pretty much put certain organizations or make certain organizations more resilient than others. And the question is that, what are the ideological origins of Jaish that make them more resilient than Al Qaeda or Hizbul or ISIS? You've mentioned this in your book, like.
Well, see, I mean, you have it's called the ecosystem of terrorism. One has to understand that, and there are various sects within Islam. Jaish Muhammad follows a Deobandi sect of Islam, which is a very hardcore fundamentalist and an orthodox and a conservative Islamic sect. Deobandi the Deobandi school of Islamic thought, basically it started in India as a revivalist movement after after the revolt of 1857, but it had its roots in the teachings of Shah Waliullah, who was living in Delhi in 1740s, and he used to argue that the Muslims have declined in India, they've lost power, because they deviated from the Islamic practices and they mingled with Hindus a lot. So he advocated distancing from Hindus and revival to Orthodox Islamic practices. Give me a second, please. Yeah, just a So Deobandi school always advocated a very revivalist and orthodox, ideology in Islamic systems, and there was a very special significance of jihad in Deobandi system. And this modern terrorist networks in Pakistan primarily, which started in 1980 after the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. All those terrorists which began in 1980 after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan were basically Deobandi terrorist networks, and they are called Harkat networks. First one was Harkatul Jihadul Islami, then Harkatul Mujahideen, Harkatul Ansar. These were all various splinter groups from the main group. Jaish Mohammed is the latest organization in the Deobandi, the terror network, the Harkat network. Taliban is also Deobandi. Now, they are very hardcore because they are very motivated. And for them, religious ideology is prime. For example, let's say you asked me to compare them with the other organizations. Lashkar is an organization which believes in the Ahle Hadith ideology. But they are very well aligned to Pakistani army vis-a-vis Jaish-e-Mohammed. So, and because they don't have a very strong social base in Pakistan, no, as Jaish-e-Mohammed has, because Jaish-e-Mohammed brings with itself the long history of the Deobandi movement, which is like 150 or let's say 250 years old history of Deobandi movement. So it has a strong social base as compared to the Lashkar, which believes in the Ahle Hadith or Wahhabi ideology, which has come from the West Asia, from Saudi region. So they are more dependent on the Pakistani army, and they are used as geostrategic assets by the Pakistani army as proxies. But Jaish is also used by Pakistani army, but they also have their own independent, strong identity. And for them, the religious motivations are foremost. That's why their motivation levels, the indoctrination levels are much higher. You just see Taliban. Taliban can be seen as a sister organization of Jaish, and you see how strongly motivated Taliban are. Like after they fought against the Americans for 21 years. Al Qaeda believes in a pan Islamist ideology, and Al Qaeda has always had very strong relationship with Maulana Masood Azhar and Jaish e Mohammed. Even, in fact, Osama bin Laden was very good friends with Maulana Masood Azhar's father. He really liked him, and he provided the seed funding to Jaish. Yes. Next question.
So when you're coming to seed funding, it seems like terror outfits have got their own organizational structure and the way they
Yes.
actually run their businesses. So I think what I'd like to know, for the benefit of the viewers as well, is that what makes Jaish so sophisticated in its organizational structure, operations, and business strategy?
Well, see, Jaish, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very strong, hardcore Deobandi radical terrorist organization. In the early days of its existence, Jaish had shown some rebellious tendencies, and in fact, Jaish cadres were involved in the assassination of General Pervez Musharraf. After which ISI realized by let's say by 2005, 2006 that that they have to use Jaish against India, but they need to find mechanisms to keep Jaish under control. So they created a system in which designed a system in which the entire organization was controlled by one family, and that is this Masood Azhar's family. It's called the Alvi family. So if you see in Jaish Muhammad, all the key positions are occupied by Maulana Masood Azhar's family. He is the chief of Jaish Muhammad, called the ideologue, chief patron. His brother Mufti Rauf, he is the operational chief of Jaish Muhammad. Then many family members of this family are holding different positions. They even send their family members, the young boys from their family, to do jihad in Jammu and Kashmir. For example, Umar Farooq, the main mastermind of Pulwama, was the nephew of Maulana Masood. He was his brother's child, and even Saifullah was also a family member of Maulana Masood. So they run this entire organization through family networks. That's why it's called a family enterprise. There's something very unique about Jaish-e-Mohammed. It helps ISI to keep the entire organization under control. And then they send their family members to die in jihad in Kashmir, which sets an example for the common people, the ordinary Muslims, who feel that that this family is such a great family, sending their own kith and kin to die in Kashmir jihad. So the motivated by those tactics and those acts, they also send their kids to join Jaish Muhammad and continue the jihad.
So there are two questions from here. I mean, obviously from somebody who's, or viewers who are not not that aware of the terror networks. The first one is that how would you differentiate between a liberal Muslim and somebody who would be a terror sympathizer, who would actually participate willingly in the terror financing of, Fedayeen attacks or terror attacks via Jaish? How would you go about differentiating that?
Well, you've asked me a very difficult question. Well, theoretically speaking, if you talk purely about the scriptures and all, it's very difficult to have even a conception of liberal Muslim, even at a very basic level. Many theologians will deny that, I mean, the Islamic scriptures do not sanction jihad and all, but overwhelming majority or the jihad as defined by some of these very powerful terror groups and the large majority of Muslims, in fact, the overwhelming majority of Muslims, they believe strongly in the idea of jihad and ideas such as Ghazwa-e-Hind and all. So if you go purely by scriptures and the theological text of Islam, it's very difficult to have even the basic framework, basic concept of liberal Muslim. But yes, in practice, no, you can have a basic arrangement or a little very temporary framework for a liberal Muslim, someone who was just confined to praying at his home for 5 times, whatever number of times he wants to pray, and someone who follows his religious principles, food habits, everything and all. But someone who doesn't nurture any hatred for the other religions, someone who loves his country, someone who doesn't indulge in any kind of terrorist activities or any sympathies even for the terrorist organizations out of any religious motivations. So for me, that can be described, as a liberal Muslim, but in a very relative sense, not in an absolute sense, because theoretically and at a scriptural level, there are major problems, which makes it very difficult to frame or to at least even conceive of the idea of a liberal Muslim.
I want to ask you a little bit about the role that women perhaps play or have played, or do they play in perpetrating terrorism or assisting, um, you know, terror sympathizers or those who would be journeying into that path? Is there a particular specific role that women may have played in the past, or are they a little bit more, or are they exempt from this pathway?
Well, I'm talking about the Islamic terrorism and this Islamist terrorism. There are very clear laid out instructions and religious injunctions, guiding the role of women. And so far, given if I look at the history, I must say that, well, females have indulged in the acts of terrorist violence also. You have the case of Black Widow in Syria and Black Widow, sorry, I don't remember exactly where it happened, but it's a very famous case. And this, using the same example, Umar Farooq, the mastermind of Pulwama, inspired two girls of Kashmir to volunteer as suicide bombers. Initially, he was planning to send a young girl from Kashmir, from a very good family, to as a suicide bomber to blow that VBIED laden car near the CRPF convoy. After that, he decided to send Insha Jan, another girl who was also his girlfriend, but it didn't work out, so he sent the other fellow. So this, which shows that there are provisions and they don't, no, I mean, they're open to the idea of sending women as suicide bombers. And second role, in Kashmir, so in Kashmiri society, traditionally, women has played a very crucial, I mean, they occupy a very powerful position in the families, despite the fact that Islam as a religion doesn't permit a very strong role for women. But the women in the Kashmiri society, they, there's the mothers of the militants, the dead militants, the people who die in jihad, they are worshipped as like great heroes in this society. They are adored, they are admired. So those women acquire a very high social status, and then they motivate others, youngsters, to join jihad. And when mother of a jihadi gives a call for jihad or supports jihad, it makes a huge impact on the society. Besides that, there are female groups who are always, if not directly fighting in jihad, they are always promoting a very rigid and strict and very orthodox form of Islam. which in a way indirectly supports aids to the cause of jihad and promotes hatred and towards Hindus or the other communities, non-Muslims, and prepares that very hateful, exclusivist mindset. For example, there's this organization called Duktarane Millat. Its head called Asiya Andrabi. She's very well connected to all the separatist outfits and terror groups, and the Duktarane Millat is a very religious. It's a religious Wahhabi organization, and they pay a very strong importance to dressing up in burqas, and they try to impose those strict Sharia codes in dressing and social life, cultural life, and in a way they aid the idea of Islamic extremism and radicalization.
Yeah, on the point of radicalization, would you say that the mechanics or the ways in which radicalization happens in the South Asian subcontinent, maybe India, would be very different from the ways it takes shape in the Western countries such as UK, Canada, perhaps Australia? Do you think that there's a differentiation between the radicalization process in India and other places in the West?
Yeah, there is a differentiation. See, you have to always factor in the fact that India has a history of 1200 years of frictions between the majority community of Hindus and Muslims. Muslims who came as invaders here, they were a very different kind of invaders in the past. Even before that, several invasions took place in India. There were foreigners invading India in various phases. For example, the Scythians came, Shakas came, the Greeks came, but none of them destroyed the local temples or tried to damage the civilizational aspect of the local communities, or to possibly convert them. But Islamic invasion was very different in the sense that they destroyed the temples here, they forcibly converted people, and there were a lot of other atrocities. So those things have left a deep scar in the Hindu mindset, in the Hindu subconscious. And before Islam, all the invaders who came to India, they got intermingled with the Hindu religion. They got assimilated in the larger framework of Hindu religion, or the Buddhist religion. But the Islam could never integrate well with the Hindus. And over the last 1200 years, we have seen phases of very strong enmity, animosity, and hatred, violence between the two communities. And the resistance was at different levels. Even at the social and cultural level, Bhakti movements came up as a kind of a resistance to the Islamic spread, because Islam brought a very egalitarian Sufi movement, which was attracting the lower caste people in India. And Indian society suffered from a caste system which was very hierarchical in nature and oppressive also. So that led to the movement of a lot of lower caste Hindus towards Islam. Though, I mean, in this larger, dominant frame of frictions and enmity, animosity between the two communities and two religions, there were spells of interaction, intermingling, and also commingling of a mixed, joint, harmonious culture. But that was a very, I would say, I mean, not a very stronger fact. The dominant part was the dominant trend in this overall trajectory was of friction. So that's the historical background. And today, the politics in India, India is a democracy. So politics in India thrives on communal issues. I mean, you have a party, BJP, which basically thrives on and propagates itself on the idea of Hindutva, and the other party, Congress, is seen as the supporter of Islamic appeasement, or as a secular liberal party. The majority Hindus today, when they see a lot of communal riots happening in different parts of country and terror attacks, they feel threatened that they have to bring a party which promotes Hindutva and which protects their interests. So that also leads to radicalization. So radicalization here I mean, it has very different dynamics, as compared to the Western world. In Western world, particularly the Islamic demographic invasion is a relatively new phenomenon, which has happened after during the Cold War and after the Cold War. Even until the end of the Cold War, those things were quite insignificant, because the Western world was able to protect and preserve its identity, cultural, civilizational identity. But over the last 20, 30 years, there has been a spate of Islamic refugees going to these countries and basically dominating social, cultural, and religious spaces in urban and rural areas, which has threatened a lot of people. So these are the differences.
Do you think, Abhinav, that currently the controversy that is surrounding the Waqf bill has is somehow correlated with politicization of um, terror financing. Do you feel that there's a connection between what's happening in India right now with the Supreme Court coming in and in its way to somewhat overturn that
Well,
parliamentary
there's again
decision?
an overlapping of multiple things. As I mentioned in my previous interview, that this is a war, and war is played in such a manner that the other side gets confused whether it's an act of war or just a political phenomenon. Waqf, at its core, this whole Waqf movement, which has been going on, is basically a project to take over large uh, masses of large chunks of land across the country. And then there are ample evidences in which Waqf bodies have acquired amassed huge, big sizes of plots of land across the country. For example, in Imphal and Manipur, they have acquired more than 10,000 square feet of land. In various other parts of country also, they have acquired property which is close to the defense establishments, air force installations, and the provisions are so draconian that they can claim anyone's property, and there is no provision for any kind of judicial accountability or redress or anything. And all the members of the Waqf board are Muslims. So that's something which makes it a very dangerous institution, and basically indulging in a civilizational war against non-Muslims. So that's the primary issue. But then see, because it's very difficult to prove all these things in a public domain or in a court of law. This whole thing gets projected as a political issue, or the issue of let's say communal body, or a purely issue of governance administration. Like, for example, Supreme Court will tend to look at it as purely from a legal point of view or from a governance point of view. They will not. Supreme Court judges are not trained to look at things from a national security point of view. They are not trained security experts, so they cannot understand it. They have a very different way to look at these things. For politicians, these things are just methods. These things are just basically let's say tools to garner more votes and communally polarize people. Their interests are very narrow and confined. They feel that, well, on these issues, you can get a good number, you can polarize the society and get a good number of votes for them. But ultimately, whatever happens at the end of it, at the end of the whole thing, it strengthens the forces of jihad. Because let's say, if, for example, if BJP or the government has brought in this law, this will basically lead to a lot of alienation among the Muslims, and the whole thing will be propagated, and it will projected as a measure, as a step to which is anti-Muslim, which is not the case, but it will be narrative will be so that it is an anti-Muslim step, which will radicalize Muslims more. They will come on the streets, they'll fight, they'll break into communal riots, police will use force. Once again, some people will be killed, which will lead to more anger, more alienation, and because of the riots, Hindus will be affected. Hindus will also get more angry. They will get more polarized and alienated, and they will start feeling. They will have feelings of revenge against them. If Supreme Court comes, let's say, comes in the favor of scrapping this Waqf amendment, that is going to generate more sympathy for the ruling party, or at least more anger among the Hindus and the majority community, that the judicial institutions are not supportive of their causes and their identities under threat. And this will again, this produce more rifts in the society in turn, and the forces of jihad will be strengthened ultimately. So this is a
So
very complex and a very fine, I would say, way of unleashing a war against a civilization.
from a layman's perspective, what you're essentially saying is that you are doomed if you do, and you're also doomed if you don't, from the Supreme Court's
Yes,
perspective,
yeah.
in maintaining law
Yes,
and order and security within the country.
yes,
That is essentially your
yes,
point of view.
yes, yeah.
Right. I think we'll move back to JM. And the question is that, do you think Jaish has developed capabilities or capacity to utilize the cyber domain to its advantage? And has it been more proactive in engaging with the cyber domain for terror financing or terror attacks, as opposed to its predecessors or the other organizations such as you said, Lashkar, Al Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah?
Well, I must admit that, I don't have much data regarding the comparative strengths of, these various organizations in cyber domain. But yes, I can, from whatever I observe, I see that the terror groups in Kashmir, they continuously improvise and they innovate. So definitely, Lashkar and Jaish both, they are, making extensive use of cyber domains for terror financing and mostly for terror funding and also, again, for the radicalization purposes for propaganda, war, etc. But so far, I have not come across any major incident of a cyber terrorism unleashed by these terror groups. But yes, as compared to ISIS and groups like Al Qaeda, their cyber capabilities may not be that good.
What about
Because
the
ISIS, Al Qaeda, they have, they have used, particularly the ISIS, has used cyber capabilities and this whole communication propaganda business, in the best possible manner, and their operations are international. They have a very, and I think their needs are different. In Kashmir, they may not need to use cyber operations, the way the global terror groups need to use it.
but if Jaish, as you mentioned, has got pan-India ambitions, would it be a
Hmm.
matter of time until they start coordinating with?
No, well, I'm not saying they are using. They must be having their own secret encrypted communication channels in which through which they are radicalizing people. They are creating, sleeper cells across the country. They are using, So I'm not denying that they're not that they're using.
So this is definitely something you feel that should be on the radar of.
Yes, yes. Of course, it should be. It must be on the radar.
Lastly, Abhinav, just going back to your book, what inspired you to write the book on Jaish Muhammad? I'm sure you've had this question off and on, but I think it's a very good way to finalize our topic.
Well, first of all, I'm always like, terrorism was one of my key interest area. I had already worked in Jammu and Kashmir before writing this book, and I was keeping a track of things. I've worked at the grassroots level, advised the Honorable Governor during the application of Article 370. So, with all those experiences, I had developed a very, I would say, nuanced sense of understanding, particularly about the militancy, terrorism, radicalization in Jammu and Kashmir. But I decided to write about Jaish because I saw that some fine Western scholars like Christine Fair and Stephen Tanker wrote a book about Lashkar-e-Taiba because Lashkar was responsible for the 26/11 Mumbai attacks in which some foreigners had died. So the Americans thought that, well, Lashkar needs to be observed. Hizbul Mujahideen was a local group, is a local group, about which there was a lot of information available. But Jaish-e-Mohammed, despite the fact that it brought India and Pakistan twice on the verge of a full-fledged war, was still eluding the watchful eyes of the global counterterrorism strategic community. And no one had written anything on that organization. And that was a very mysterious organization with very unique ways of operating. So, that's why I decided to write about Jaish.
Thank you
There was
very
a
much.
gap.
There was a gap that you wanted to successfully, and you've
Yes,
obviously
yes,
successfully completed that. So thank you so
yes.
much, Abhinav, for this part two.
Thank you. Thank you, Rajita. Thank you very much. Okay.
Hope to see you back soon on the channel.
Sure, sure.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye.